When Russia invaded Ukraine in February 2022, President Vladimir Putin, along with most of the world, expected a quick victory for Russia. At best, it would last a few weeks. The Ukrainian government would collapse, their military would surrender, and Russian flags would fly over Kyiv before the West could even respond. 3.5 years later, that prediction looks like a sick joke. Not only did Ukraine survive, it's positioned to do something that seemed impossible just months ago: win back every inch of occupied territory. And Russia, despite all its bluster, is going to burn itself to ashes trying to stop it. Let's examine why Ukraine is positioned to reclaim its territory and how Russia's desperate attempts to prevent this will ultimately destroy what's left of its military power. Now, the idea that Ukraine will not only survive but thrive following the war isn't wishful thinking or propaganda. It's cold, hard mathematics combined with undeniable strategic realities that are converging into a perfect storm for Putin's regime. Russia is running out of time, equipment, money, and options. Meanwhile, Ukraine is getting stronger, smarter, and more capable with each passing month. According to a comprehensive analysis by The Insider and corroborated by multiple Western intelligence agencies, Russia has already lost more than half of its available military hardware, and most of the evidence is visual confirmations of successful Ukrainian strikes. Open-source intelligence group Oryx has documented close to 23,000 units of Russian military equipment destroyed, damaged, or captured since the invasion began, compared to Ukraine's 9,900. These numbers were calculated up to the end of September 2025, slightly over 43 months into the war. Even if we look at destroyed rather than just damaged equipment, Russia has still suffered some heavy losses. It's lost 10,300 armored vehicles versus Ukraine's 3,800. Considering that Russia started with between 13,000 and 16,000 tanks and 11,400 armored personnel carriers, this represents a significant loss. And these aren't losses that can be easily replaced. Approximately 50% of Russia's lost equipment comes from Soviet-era stockpiles that were amassed over decades in anticipation of a World War III scenario. Those stockpiles are finite, and they're being depleted at an alarming rate. As a quick reference, National Interest had suggested Russia had a stockpile of roughly 12,000 tanks in reserves in the early 2020s. Fast forward 5 years, and Russia had practically run through all of that stockpile and has been using up reserves. Military analyst Andriy Tarasenko warns that Russia's repairable equipment reserves could be exhausted within 12 to 18 months unless production increases to between 700 and 1,000 armored vehicles annually. The problem with that strategy is that Russia's current industrial capacity simply can't meet that target. Russia can only produce about 250 T-90M tanks and 460 BMP-3 infantry fighting vehicles per year. This is significantly less than the number of tanks Russia is losing every year. Things are so bad, Russia has turned to raiding the closet. They've been forced to pull progressively older equipment from storage. After starting with relatively modern, upgraded T-72s, T-80s, and T-90s, Russia moved to T-62s by May 2022. By November 2024, Russian forces were reportedly mobilizing T-34s, tanks that last saw action in World War II, although there are no confirmed sightings on the battlefield. But even back then, the move to older tanks was considered a warning sign that Russia couldn't sustain this war forever without major strategic changes that would never really come. And while Russia's stockpiles are dwindling, Ukraine has been quietly revolutionizing modern warfare, mainly through improved defensive systems, layering surveillance and drone missions, as well as denying Russia the opportunity to gain momentum on any part of the front. As a result, by early 2025, Russian territorial gains had plummeted dramatically. According to British intelligence and Ukrainian open-source intelligence website Deep State, Russian forces seized just 51 square miles of Ukrainian territory in March 2025, down from 74 in February and 125 in January. This was also a dramatic decline from the over 282 square miles captured in November 2024. Despite rapidly accelerating its offensive moves throughout the latter half of 2024, Russia was simply unable to keep up the momentum for more than a few months. Even more telling is the price Russia now pays for each square kilometer. Deep State also calculated that in Kharkiv, Luhansk, and Donetsk oblasts, Russia needed to conduct over 35 assaults per square kilometer captured in March 2025, up from 14.2 in February and just 7.1 in November 2024. Basically, Russia needs to perform 5 times as many offensive operations to gain any sort of leverage and territorial gains over the front than just 6 months before. This dramatic shift can be traced to specific Ukrainian military improvements. The January 2025 appointment of General Mikhailo Drapati as commander of the Cortesia Operational and Strategic Group of Forces marked a turning point. By targeting Russian logistics routes, rotating newly formed brigades for rearmament while deploying veteran units, and enhancing fortifications around key areas like Pokrovsk, Tripati effectively halted Russian advances and depleted their combat capabilities. The results spoke for themselves. By September 2025, Ukraine achieved significant territorial gains in the Pokrovsk direction through coordinated drone swarms and ground operations to create 3 separate encirclements of Russian troops. During the battle for Dobropilia alone, more than 100 Russians were captured, 1,300 killed, and another 1,100 wounded. Ukrainian forces fully cleared Pankivka, and combat footage showed how devastating Ukrainian drone strikes had become. Out of 10 Russian soldiers attempting to advance, only 1 survived long enough to surrender. Ukraine even reclaimed 62 square kilometers of territory in a single month in 2025, contradicting Putin's claims about advancing in all directions. Russia's military crisis is compounded by an economic catastrophe that's accelerating with each passing month. Russia's economy is the primary driver behind its military success. But the same could be said in reverse. As soon as Russia's military stumbled, it opened the door for Western sanctions to target the country's economy and cut off funding to keep up the momentum. Russia's oil and gas revenues, which historically accounted for 30 to 50% of government income, plummeted 35% year over year in May 2025. This comes in the same year as the defense spending devours 40% of the entire federal budget, a level not seen since the Soviet era. Putin has been forced to announce that military spending will be reduced by roughly 4.4% for 2026, essentially admitting Russia can't sustain the current tempo. But lowering defense spending gets even worse when inflation enters the picture. Russian inflation is officially only around 8 to 10% year over year, but some sources suggest that the actual inflation could be over 20% when accounting for disproportionate increases in prices of food and chemicals. Russia's liquid reserves are also running out, with some economists forecasting depletion by the end of 2025 or early 26. The Russian central bank has already warned of liquidity problems, while banks face a structural deficit that threatens to cascade through the entire economy. Essentially, Russia is artificially trying to manage its economic crisis with capital controls, rapid interest rate drops, and widespread government interventions in systems that are absolutely vital for the war effort and perceived quality of life in the country. Ukraine is also leveraging Russia's economic vulnerability with deadly results. Through systematic drone strikes on Russian oil refineries and fuel infrastructure, Ukraine has cost Russia roughly 17% of its refining capacity for oil and gas. Reuters calculated that strikes on multiple refineries directly correlated with the same percentage decline in Russia's oil and gas revenue between March 2024 and March 25. Then there are Western sanctions, which are hitting Russia's bottom line. The European Union has instituted a price cap on Russian oil, dropping from $60 per barrel to under $48, resulting in Russian Ural crude crashing from nearly $70 per barrel to $50 in a year. With the EU also planning to eliminate Russian imports by 2027, Russia is losing its primary export market. To counter this loss, Russia has turned to China and India to make up the shortfall, but at a devastating cost. China now demands up to a 35% discount compared to the prices Russia commanded from the EU. And for other markets, Russia has been forced to utilize a shadow fleet, that is, ships registered under fake names and flying foreign flags, to avoid detection. But these ships are old, can't be maintained properly, and are under increased scrutiny from Western inspection, skyrocketing the costs of transporting oil via tankers and directly impacting Russia's bottom line. But while Russia scrapes the bottom of its Soviet-era barrel, Ukraine is flourishing. The country is experiencing a military-industrial renaissance that's reshaping the balance of power. In 2025, the overall capacity of Ukraine's defense industry is expected to reach $35 billion, up from just $1 billion at the onset of the invasion in 2022. Ukraine now produces around one-third of all weapons, ammunition, and equipment used by the country's armed forces. In critical areas like drone production, the figure is close to 100%, as the West simply doesn't have the operational capacities to procure low-cost drones at scale without heavy administrative pushback. And this goes beyond just the quantity of weapons. Ukraine has been pushing the pedal to the metal with innovation and testing. Prototypes are developed, tested, and deployed into a final product within months rather than the years that it takes traditional military-industrial complexes. This success can be attributed to the country's distributed network of nearly 900 suppliers, ranging from major companies to garage workshops, which creates redundancy and cost efficiency that the West and even Russia's centralized system cannot compete with. When one workshop discovers an improvement, that information gets shared across the entire network within days through systems like the Delta Information Coordination Platform. The results are visible on every front. Ukraine's drone warfare capabilities have revolutionized combat, with FPV drones destroying Russian tanks costing millions, with units that cost a few $1,000s each. Ukraine's naval drones have forced Russia's Black Sea fleet to flee from Crimea to Russian ports. effectively ceding control of Ukrainian shipping lanes and revitalizing the country's grain exports to pre-war levels in under 18 months. And then there are Ukraine's long-range strike capabilities. What started as modest drones performing surveillance work has now soared into operations that would target military compounds hundreds of miles into Russia's territory, destroying oil refineries, munitions depots, and even air bases. The pinnacle of this progress was arguably Operation Spiderweb, which reached 2,700 miles into Russian territory and damaged or destroyed roughly a third of Russia's strategic bomber fleet. Then there's the soldiers, or lack thereof. Beyond equipment and economics, Russia faces a manpower crisis that threatens to collapse its entire war effort. The numbers are simply unsustainable. Russia has suffered over 1 million casualties since the war began. Ukrainian government initiative I Want to Live reported that 281,550 Russian soldiers were killed, wounded, or lost in action in just the first 8 months of 2025 alone. Of these, 86,744 were confirmed killed, with almost 34,000 missing and possibly dead. Russia's daily casualty rate has also increased steadily. At the start of the war, in November 2022, Russia was losing 560 soldiers per day. In 2025, that number reached over 1,300. If this rate continues, Russia could suffer another 440,000 casualties annually, nearly half of what it suffered in the first 3 years. But beyond simply losing soldiers, the country can't really get more of them in time. Russia's monthly recruitment rate is either barely sufficient or slightly below what's needed to replace battlefield losses. Indicators suggest that enlistment rates dropped by as much as 60% from 2024 to early 25, and Moscow might not even have the option of replenishing forces with prisoners, having nearly exhausted that supply. Russia's request for not one but 2 waves of North Korean troops to fight alongside them in Ukraine cements its desperation, but even then, the number of foreign recruits is simply too small to matter in the long run. The demographic impact extends far beyond the battlefield. Russia's military in 2025 represented 3% of the country's labor force, which is a 40% increase from 2020. Working-aged men are systematically removed from the workforce with nobody to replace them, often permanently, by being shipped to Ukraine and killed. Combined with Russia's catastrophically low fertility rate from the 1990s onwards, Russia is missing an entire generation of young adults who would be joining the workforce and forming families. One analysis suggests the number of workers between ages 16 and 35 dropped by 1.33 million in 2022 alone. Extrapolate that across age ranges, and you get a multi-million labor deficit that's practically impossible to recover from naturally. Russian state media itself acknowledged the military-industrial complex faced a shortage of up to 120,000 engineers, with total manpower shortfalls estimated at 400,000. When you put all of these factors together, it becomes clear that Russia is fighting a war of attrition it can no longer win. Forbes calculated that at Russia's April 2025 rate of progress, capturing only 68 square miles of Ukrainian territory per month, it would take approximately 230 years to occupy all of Ukraine. At the current casualty rate of 1,200 soldiers per day, that would require roughly 100 million Russian casualties. That's 70% of Russia's current population. Obviously, the war won't last 230 years. Something has to give, and all evidence suggests it will be Russia's military capacity, not Ukraine's will to fight. Let's get back to the military equipment shortages for a moment. Without armored vehicles, artillery, and air defense systems, Russia can't really conduct offensive operations in any meaningful way. To compensate, Russian forces have started to rely on meat-wave infantry assaults unsupported by mechanized infantry or armored vehicles, resulting in catastrophic casualties for negligible gain. Meanwhile, Ukraine's defensive capabilities keep improving. General Alexander Syrskyi noted that the Ukrainian military still controlled a sliver of territory in Kursk Oblast as late as June 2025, 10 months after the initial invasion. This was despite repeated Russian attempts to mount a decisive counteroffensive, deploying over 10,000 North Korean troops to the region, and Ukraine being forced to utilize a single paved road for a bulk of its resupply operations. Kursk has been used as a bargaining chip with the West to showcase just how capable Ukraine is at capturing and holding territory against all odds, directly leading to increased media coverage, donations packages, and even strike policies for Western-donated missiles. At the same time, Putin's determination to continue this war has also transformed Russia's tactical defeats into a strategic catastrophe. Every month the war continues, Russia's geopolitical position weakens irreversibly. Russia's military exports, once a major source of revenue and geopolitical influence, have collapsed by 92% between 2021 and 24. Potential customers watched Russian equipment get systematically dismantled by Ukrainian forces and decided to shop elsewhere. Russia's aerospace industry faces a similar level of break. The government promised to produce over 1,000 civil aircraft by 2030, but has delivered only 5 in 3 years of war. The military aviation picture is equally concerning. with the Russian Air Force flying at less than 75% of pre-war capacity and losing 60 aircraft annually just from overuse and poor maintenance, all the while producing only 26 new aircraft per year. Meanwhile, Russia's relationships with its few remaining allies are becoming increasingly one-sided. China extracts massive discounts on Russian energy exports and uses Russia as a cautionary tale about challenging Western economic dominance. North Korea sends defective ammunition and conscripts for Russia's meat grinder tactics. Iran provides drones but watches Russia's military reputation crumble in real time. And despite that, Russia has failed to move any of its goalposts on the global stage. Once Putin decided to go all in on Ukraine, the West realized that Russia would likely never stop with the aggression. As a result, NATO countries sharply increased their defense spending. Sweden and Finland joined NATO to further cut off Russia's access to the Baltic seaports and reduce its military presence in the region. Germany has started siding with the US on spending up to 5% of its GDP on military and national defense, with roughly 30% of that being used on infrastructure and support systems that provide benefits to the entire Central Europe. The domestic political implications are equally severe. Putin has spent over 2 decades building his legitimacy around restoring Russian greatness and standing up to the West. Losing a war to Ukraine, a country he claims doesn't truly exist without Russia, would shatter that narrative completely. His inner circle of Siloviki, security service veterans, would face a stark choice: continue following Putin into economic and military oblivion, or remove him and salvage what's left of Russia's power. And considering how men of power like to cling to it until the bitter end, the latter scenario is getting increasingly likely. Right about now, you might be wondering how Ukraine actually plans to win back every inch of occupied territory. The answer is patience, preparation, and exploiting Russia's cascading failures. While there are no exact strategies in place, we can draw up a probable scenario based on what we've seen from the past 3.5 years. Phase 1 is already underway: systematic degradation of Russian combat power. Ukraine doesn't need to launch a massive offensive while Russia is destroying itself. Every tank Russia loses and cannot replace, every artillery shell fired from dwindling North Korean supplies, every soldier killed in pointless meatwave attacks, these all bring Ukraine closer to the conditions needed for successful counteroffensives. Ukraine's strategy is particularly effective by attacking what Russia can't easily replace: high-value equipment, logistics infrastructure, ammunition depots, and oil refineries. Each successful strike has multiplier effects. Destroying a single ammunition depot can reduce Russian artillery fire across an entire sector for weeks. Taking out an oil refinery reduces Russia's export revenue and domestic fuel supplies simultaneously. Eliminating S-400 air defense systems opens up even more airspace for Ukrainian aircraft and drones. Phase 2 will likely begin when Russia reaches its breaking point, probably sometime before or during 2026. Western intelligence assessments consistently point to this time frame for critical Russian equipment shortages. When Russia no longer has sufficient armor to conduct offensive operations, the dynamic shifts fundamentally. At that point, Ukraine can leverage its growing domestic military production, continued Western support, and superior tactical innovation to launch coordinated counteroffensives. The 2022 Kharkiv counteroffensive demonstrated Ukraine's capability to launch decisive attacks. Ukrainian forces advanced an average of 4.8 miles per day, liberating over 3,700 square miles in a matter of weeks. That happened when Russia still had substantial equipment reserves. Imagine what Ukraine can accomplish when Russia is scraping together T-34s and World War II-era artillery. Phase 3 would then involve holding liberated territory and preventing Russian counterattacks. This is where Ukraine's drone truly becomes key. Even if Russia somehow manages to reconstitute offensive forces, they would face a battlefield environment where every vehicle movement, every troop concentration, every supply convoy can be identified and destroyed by relatively cheap Ukrainian drones operating in vast numbers. The final phase of the plan is something that will be the most challenging: liberating Crimea. Russia's Black Sea Fleet has already fled Sevastopol due to Ukrainian strikes. The Kerch Bridge remains vulnerable to long-range Ukrainian weapons. Without naval dominance and with overextended supply lines, Russian forces in Crimea will be isolated and encircled once Ukraine liberates the land corridor through southern Ukraine. Of course, this entirely depends on how much Ukraine can stop its own military from hemorrhaging resources. Despite eking out win after win and skyrocketing its defense budget and presence, Ukraine is still fighting on the back foot in terms of actual troop numbers, military equipment, and funding. Ukraine also needs to rely on persistent Western support. Previous half measures, where the EU was sanctioning Russian tech companies but also purchasing Russian oil and gas on the side, showed just how fragile global supply chains are to sudden changes. But given that Ukraine has proved time and time again that Western investments into the country practically multiply in results achieved on the field, it's highly likely that the West continues its own offensive on the Russian economy and supply lines. Beyond that, countries that share a border with Russia have a direct incentive to create a more aggressive approach to delivering prototype weapons to Ukraine. Reducing Russia's capability of waging war staves off the practically inevitable Russia-NATO conflict, which was at one point forecast for 2025, then revised to happen sometime before 2030. But if Ukraine does manage to win the war, Russia might not even exist to do battle with NATO next. Faced with a failing economy, Putin will be forced to essentially play by China's playbook, surrendering Russia's plentiful resources for cheap and likely returning to depend on Western trade to keep the country afloat, much like it did after Russia arose from the ashes of the Soviet Union. Until then, all we can do is watch and see how the events unfold. Thanks for watching, and to understand how Ukraine's innovative military strategies continue evolving, check out our analysis of Operation Spiderweb. And to stay up to date with the war's progress and other vital events in global geopolitics, subscribe to The Military Show for daily videos.